Harmony. We love it. Even its name has been borrowed by everyday language to mean closeness, friendliness, human warmth, cooperation, and well-being. Unlike rhythm and melody, harmony wasn't part of music from the beginning. It's an upstart. It came into life gradually during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But what an upstart, and how does it work? In this program, I'm going to lift the lid on harmony and look beneath the surface of this, the most sophisticated and seductive of all music's component parts. Over the ages, philosophers, visionaries, and scientists have suggested that there might be in nature some kind of celestial or perfect music, that there might be music in the orbiting of the planets and the spheres themselves. Others have talked of the heavenly music of angels and archangels. Why have they believed this? What aspect of music is it that has provoked such speculation? The answer is harmony. It seems to be more mystical, elusive, and magical than other elements of music. It feels like it's come from some place or time that's beyond our everyday experience. But while it's tempting to imagine that harmony has somehow floated down to us from heaven, the truth is that harmony has been painstakingly constructed over centuries of human creative endeavour and has allowed composers to manipulate our emotions like no other aspect of music. It has its rules and tricks. It's like a delicate or complicated machine, a beautiful clock, say, or a rich and exotic language where every nuance can mean the difference between perfect understanding and chaos. At its most basic, harmony is intentional coming together of two or more sounds for pleasant effect. All the world's musical cultures share this idea. In East Asian gamelan music, which has been relatively unchanged for hundreds of years, several sounds may be occurring simultaneously at any one moment. But harmony in Western music is doing something else altogether, turning the collision of notes into a deliberate and complex structure of its own. Western harmony began separating off from all other world musics in around the 12th century. And the best way to get to grips with what harmony does and how is to look at that moment of separation, to see what happened when European harmony started to have a mind of its own, when it stopped being merely simultaneous sounds. This is a symphony. It's an ancient European stringed instrument. It's kind of a cross between a violin and a sewing machine. The apparently self-perpetuating note it makes is called a drone. Bagpipes do drones as well. In fact, a lot of the world's folk music involves drones of one kind or another. You turn the wheel and make a continuous note, and above it you can play or sing any melody you like. Ye oldie ghetto blaster. Because the drone is constant, every note the singer sings coincides with it, and we hear two notes simultaneously. But this is a crude kind of harmony because the drone never moves. Then someone had the idea of a movable drone. Again, a crude sort of harmony because the drone simply shadows the melody. If the melody goes up, so does the drone. If it goes down, so does the drone. It's as if they are parallel railway lines that weave across the countryside a few feet apart. In this piece, two singers sing the melody while two sing the drone at a lower pitch. This system of parallel lines gradually disappeared as a new kind of harmony came into being that would hold sway for 700 years right up to the present day. Dream, 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 dream. In the next part, we'll find out how the development of chords revolutionized Western music.
Sing cuckoo, no sing cuckoo, no sing cuckoo, no sing cuckoo, no summer is you coming in, summer is you coming in.
Back in 1250, this English song, Summer is a Comin' In, was the equivalent of a modern-day pop hit. Why is this song so important in the history of harmony? Well, it's because it has a very special drone. This drone moves independently of the tune. What's important is the way that it shifts from this mini chord to this mini chord. And if you play them one after another like this, you have the beginning of what's called a chord progression. And chord progressions are the lifeblood of all Western harmony. Harmony, that is, that doesn't stay static, it moves.
Summer is you coming in, 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 summer is you coming in.
What's revolutionary about these two-note chords is this. Whenever a note in the melody collides with the two supporting drones, a three-note chord is created. This is a momentous departure in music's history. Three-note chords are the foundation of Western harmony. Having found that chords could move, the next stage was to find out which chords sounded best in what order. The progressive movement from chord to chord in music can be totally random. There's no rule that says it can't. I could accompany the tune of Summer is a Comin' In with these two chords, if I really wanted to. Summer is a comin' in, now they sing cuckoo. It's not very nice sounding, but it is harmony of a kind. So what is it that determines which chords you use to accompany your melody? In the early days of chordal harmony, they very quickly developed strict, non-random rules about what you should do. And these ideas became deeply entrenched in the minds of composers over the next 500 years. So where did these strict ideas come from? Who determined that there are hierarchies of notes and that each chord should be made up of three notes? Well, they weren't invented by some brilliant composer or developed by a committee. Hierarchies of notes were there all along, before we humans found them. Once discovered, their power was harnessed and exploited, and it gave immense energy and drive to Western harmony. I'm going to reveal this secret of nature just through the plucking of a harp string. You might think that each of these harp strings gave you one note per pluck.
Well, you'd be wrong. Depending on how you pluck it, each string has 2, 3, or even 4 different notes on offer. It's just that the extra ones are in hiding, and if no one told you how to find them, they'd stay a secret forever. What's more, they were put there by nature, not humankind. Katrin will now play some of the secret notes.
These hidden notes are called harmonics, and harmonics are what help to create hierarchies in notes and chords.
It just so happens that the note B flat, for example,
when it occurs in nature, actually has contained within it a spectrum of other notes, just like the invisible colours inherent in natural white light. The existence of these other, barely audible notes gives the sound its rich and full quality. Now let's hear the fundamental note you get when you pluck the string normally. Now Katrin will play the same string with her palm against the string in order to reveal the hidden first harmonic. Magic, isn't it? As a matter of fact, every single note has a whole series of its own harmonics, but the human ear can only pick out the first 3 or 4 in the sequence. A dog or a dolphin might be able to hear more of them, which is presumably why you don't get that many harp-playing dolphins and Labradors, since it must be a right racket to them. Here's the clever bit. When European musicians began using chords, the first clusters they started to put together were formed by teasing out the nearly silent harmonics and giving them a full-bodied presence in the sound. So if your basic note was B flat, and your harmonics were a high and quiet F, and an even quieter, even higher D, you turned these into proper sounding notes by using the non-harmonic equivalents and making a chord out of them. The basic meat and veg chord that we make up from harmonics is known as a triad, not because of any links with organised crime, but because it's made up of 3 principal notes. Here's the C major triad. You can build a triad based on any note you like. So on F, it's this, on G, it's this, and so on. In fact, every note in the Western scale is capable of generating its own major triad, so long as you enlist the help of some of the black notes, the sharps and flats. In other words, you can have 12 separate major triads, and with them you can harmonise an enormous amount of music, from the medieval troubadours to rock and roll.
Some little never let it show its fun. Oh, baby, drive me crazy. Oh, goodness gracious, crazy balls of fire.
Tender is my heart, screwing up my life. Someone who can heal my mind. Come on, come on, come on. We get through it. Come on, come on, come on. Love's the greatest thing.
But if you only had those 12 major triads, you'd be missing out big time without their dark side, the minor triads. A minor triad differs from its major siblings in only one respect. Its middle note is a half step lower in pitch. This seemingly tiny adjustment has a big impact. It turns the mood of the chord somber. Why? Well, the middle note of a minor chord is much less prominent in the harmonic series than the middle note of a major chord. It's still there all right, but it's faint and distant. This weakens the minor chord. It's as if it has fewer natural ingredients. It's not so organic. It's more fragile and vulnerable than the major. That's why sad music on the whole is minor and happy music is major. Take this ravishingly beautiful and sad piece in a minor key.
Because in Western music there are 12 basic notes to choose from, we now have 12 major triads and 12 minor triads, and with them we can add chords to almost any piece in the whole of the Western repertoire. There are many ways of bringing chords to life in music. One way is to have a piano or a guitar or something similar and simply thrash them out one after another in blocks underneath the melody, like this. Another way is to interweave separate individual melody lines so that they coagulate into chords as they coincide. This is called polyphony, meaning many voices. In this piece of 16th century choral music you're about to hear, the chords are made up from intermingled solo vocal lines. It's the opening of William Byrd's Mass for Four Voices, and though it doesn't sound like it, what you're actually hearing is a series of shifting chords.
So how do you select the appropriate chords for a tune? Guesswork? Luck? Trial and error? Well, believe it or not, that is one way you can do it, but it's very slow and frustrating. There's a much simpler and more effective way. Each note in your melody has a possible 6 chords to which it belongs. So you decide which one of the 6 best fits the mood of the song at any particular point. Let's do it with Silent Night. First, we've got to identify the important beats or accents in the tune. These are the same as they would be if it were a poem. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. The melody notes for those important accented notes are G for silent, Si, and G again for holy, Ho, and then D for the first All, and C for the second All. Now we've got to find strong chords to fit those notes. So the first note, Si, is a G, and it can fit G major, G minor, E minor, E flat major, and C major. But since the tune falls down to an E just in the next phrase, silent night, it would be good to have one chord that would fit both those notes. And that narrows our choice. We've got E minor, too gloomy for Christmas, I think, and C major, which sounds just right. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. This may be a very simple example, but it's a method that works. The 24 major and minor triads handled almost every harmonization going between about 1200 and 1600. Not bad. Sleep in heavenly peace. Sleep in heavenly peace. So we've established our basic menu of available triads thanks to nature's inbuilt harmonics. We've learnt how to fit a note to a chord, and we've got the idea that major and minor chords feel different in mood. We now also know that chords have mysterious relationships with each other that set up a kind of forward movement or progression in the way they're placed. This last technique is of vital importance to understanding why some harmony sounds great and some sounds rubbish. So let's find out more about chord progressions. All the chord progressions there are in Western music involve some kind of magnetic effect, with the stronger chords attracting and repelling the other chords around them. But there's one relationship that's more fundamental than all the others. The most important partnership between two chords in all Western music is called the tonic-dominant relationship. It's the relationship between the chords based on the first, the tonic, and the fifth, the dominant note of any scale. each key has its own tonic dominant chords. In the key of C, for example, they are C and G. Composers like Mozart and Beethoven were enthralled to the tonic-dominant relationship. But it isn't just classical composers who like to rock between tonic and dominant. The dominant note acts like a shadow or an alter ego to the main note, the tonic. And from the 15th century onwards, composers began to see it as an alternative centre of gravity for their tunes and for their harmonies, because they discovered that the dominant chord was dependent on the tonic. It always wanted to lead back to the tonic, and so they used this feature to great effect over and over again. Listen to this. It's the climactic ending of the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. All it is a series of dominant tonic chords thrashed out one after another. This surely is excessive tonic dominant syndrome, but Ludwig van wasn't the only one at it. Between 1650 and 1850, all classical composers became infatuated with the tonic dominant relationship, so much so that they began to construct whole pieces around a journey from tonic to dominant and back again. And if you're going to take a return trip like that, you need to stop at other places on the way. So they put together strings of chords into sequences that did just that. And to see how chord sequences first emerged in Western music, we have to travel back in time to the dance music of Renaissance Europe. The emergence of chord progressions was to be crucial to the development of harmony. In the early 1500s, we see for the first time in printed music the evidence of repeated, durable chord progressions. Dance music was extremely fashionable in the courts of Europe. What seemed to work best was music with strong chord patterns. Two of these became so widespread that they were given the names passamezzo antico and passamezzo moderno. Both were based on the journey from the tonic to the dominant and back again.
The passamezzo antico pattern goes like this. That's the halfway point at the dominant, and then we head home again. All sorts of melodies would fit onto that pattern, and you can hear the passamezzo antico in action in that most famous of 16th century songs, Greensleeves. Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me out discourteously, for I have loved...
The stately passamezzo antico was popular enough, but its successor, the passamezzo moderno, was the really big hit. It went on to become the most widely used chord sequence of all time. 500 years after it was first written down, its influence can still be heard.
Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music. Any old way you choose it. It's got a backbeat, you can't lose it.
What was the secret of its success? You see, whereas the passamezzo antico was in a sombre minor mood, the moderno was in a sunny major mood. It's a thoroughly organic, all-natural chord progression. It also introduces a third important chord after the tonic and the dominant, the imaginatively titled subdominant. The subdominant was the chord we heard in the second line of Silent Night. Round yon virgin mother and child.
And here's a more recent song with exactly the same chord progression. I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill, on Blueberry Hill.
When I found you.
Yes, even Blueberry Hill follows the exact pattern of a passamezzo moderno.
On Blueberry Hill.
The whole of the moderno's pattern uses only these three chords, the tonic, the dominant and the subdominant. The subdominant muscled itself into the picture by acting as a kind of mirror image to the dominant, with the tonic sitting in the middle as a fulcrum. You'll see that this note, C, is 5 white notes lower than the dominant, G, and 5 white notes higher than the subdominant, F. It sits in the middle, holding the balance of power. These three chords, the tonic, the dominant and the subdominant, were to become so crucial and so ubiquitous in the centuries that followed that they were known collectively as the primary triads. They're the equivalent of the primary colours in art. Great swathes of Western music rely almost exclusively on the primary triads, from Vivaldi to Elvis.
Well, it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you step on my blue suede shoe.
So far, we've been talking about harmony as something that's pleasing on the ear. And that's how things were up until the 17th century, when a new and rather naughty idea crept into harmony: discord. Discord, or dissonance, is where there is a deliberate collision of notes that aren't supposed to fit together, when they belong to the wrong triads, for instance. The issue of dissonance has been something of a battlefield over the centuries. For a start, no one's been totally sure which collisions qualify as a dissonance and which don't. In medieval times, almost everything was classified as a dissonance, whereas by the end of the 19th century, almost nothing was. It has a lot to do, of course, with our ears becoming accustomed to unfamiliar sounds. If you'd played Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze to anyone in the Middle Ages, they'd have probably passed out. And yet to our ears it doesn't sound particularly shocking because we've grown used to it. In fact, in terms of pure dissonance, clashing notes, Purple Haze has hardly any at all.
Don't know why. Excuse me while I kiss this guy.
It begins with a collision of two notes that was considered in the Middle Ages such a horrible dissonance that the church authorities called it the devil in music. But even this devilish clash by Bach's time, around 1700, was considered more or less harmless. And by Wagner and Tchaikovsky's time, the Romantic era, it was meat and veg to all composers. So is the concept of dissonance gradually dying out then as we get used to everything? The answer is we seem to be getting used to some dissonance, but not all of it. There are pieces of classical music that were written ages ago that still sound discordant and unnerving no matter how many times you hear them. Take this piece by the French composer Pierre Boulez, written half a century ago. This is the sort of dissonance that popular music avoids like the plague. In the right hands, though, the subtle use of dissonance is one of music's great pleasures, because the point is that dissonance can be cleverly used and cleverly disguised. In the days when the church had great power over what people did, including what composers composed, dissonance was frowned upon or even banned. So it became a kind of game for composers to get around the rules by slipping in cunningly disguised dissonances to spice up their music. They found loopholes in the law and exploited them vigorously. One such get-out-of-jail-free card was a trick known as passing notes. Passing notes are like passengers in transit at airports. Because they're only passing through a country, not staying in it, they're outside customs control and not governed by the same laws and restrictions as the people who are entering the country in earnest. So naughty notes can be put into chords as long as they're clearly passing through and on their way to the next one. This is what I mean. You wouldn't normally expect to hear this note with this chord because it sounds so dissonant. In fact, it's the kind of tooth-grating clash that a devout Christian composer like J.S. Bach shouldn't have been able to get away with, not in 1700 anyway. But because the inner voices of this German hymn we're about to hear are passing through on their way towards other notes, when they collide, the dissonance is allowed. Here's the original. See if you can spot that clashing chord. In the third line, when the choir sing, "Zu dir schreien wir aus Herzens Begehr." Passing notes didn't die out as the rules on dissonance relaxed over the centuries. It's just that our ears have become accustomed to correcting the dissonance in our heads automatically. Or we got to like it through familiarity. You wouldn't leap to harmonise this note with this unsympathetic chord unless you were treating it as a passing note on its way down the scale to here. Or unless you were some kind of rebel. Getting around the authorities by using passing notes was one trick. Another was a technique known as suspension. If passing notes were travellers in transit, suspended notes were passengers who'd missed their flight altogether and were sitting in the departure lounge waiting to be transferred to the next one. Suspended notes are a form of dissonance we all adore. Here's a song that begins with a whole series of them. Well, I can't forget this evening and your face as you were leaving. Well, I guess that's just the way the story goes. You always smile, but in your eyes your sorrow shows. Yes, it shows. Suspending a note means letting it linger over the territory of a chord to which it doesn't really belong, creating a delicious sense of tension by doing so. In Without You, the melody is almost entirely made up of suspensions. So in the first phrase, well, I can't forget this evening, the tune is being held over a chord to which it doesn't belong. It wants to resolve to here. Similarly, in the second phrase, and your face as you were leaving, the same thing's happening. Without all these lingering suspensions, the verse would sound something like this. Well, I can't forget this evening and your face as you were leaving. Well, I guess that's just the way the story goes. I mean, it's sweet, but it's a bit clunky, basically. And the way that a suspension gets its kicks is by holding on for as long as possible and then shifting down to the correct note at the last minute.
Can't forget this evening or your face as you were leaving, but I guess that's just the way the story goes. You always smile, but in your eyes your sorrow shows. Yes, it shows. Whoa.
Suspended notes aren't just the domain of broken-hearted pop divas either. Suspensions were a way for Baroque and Renaissance composers to slip dissonance into their pieces, especially if they were trying to evoke feelings of pain, unease, or passion. One such composer was Antonio Lotti, who in his Crucifixus managed to squeeze 49 consecutive suspensions into a piece lasting just 41 bars. As you might expect, the tension and release of suspension was of enormous interest to romantic composers, agonizing over love, despairing over the unfairness of life, the artist's struggle, etc., etc. And the most talked about chord sequence in the whole of the classical repertoire, which occurs in Wagner's 1865 opera Tristan and Isolde, is a deliberately unsatisfying suspension, which is entirely appropriate since it is supposed to represent an unresolved, unconsummated passion. This is the chord sequence that caused so much comment and furore in the classical music world. The point about this little phrase is that it's one suspension followed by another. Not quite Lotti's 49, I grant you, but significant nonetheless, because all of Lotti's suspensions immediately resolve onto non-dissonant chords in a continuous cycle of tension and relaxation, tension and relaxation. But Wagner's Tristan chords, on the other hand, quite deliberately do not resolve. Tristan and Isolde's relationship, we're led to believe, can only be consummated in death, so their music can only resolve at the very end of the opera when they both die. Wagner is using musical suspension to depict sexual frustration. What is the effect of this on us, the listeners? Because of these unresolved suspensions, we feel the unbearable tension and longing that Wagner wanted us to feel. Before Wagner, it was normal to resolve your suspensions, to put that passenger on the next flight out, come what may. Wagner started a trend whereby the passengers were left stranded in the terminal. That trend is as prevalent today as it was then. The opening of Coldplay's Politic, the song that kickstarts their CD A Rush of Blood to the Head, derives its energy and its tension from two unresolved suspensions.
Time and give me space, and give me real, don't give me fake.
On our voyage of discovery into the mysteries of harmony, we've met the 24 basic triads and mischievous ways of slipping dissonances into them through passing notes and suspensions. But composers didn't stop there. They kept on trying to invent new chords. They turned them upside down, stretched them, squeezed them, and created all sorts of exotic new hybrids. In the next part, we're going to look at these chord mutations and how they changed the course of modern music.
As composers became more adventurous with their harmonies, they began to do to chords what rose growers did to roses. They would take a note from one chord and graft it onto the root or stalk of another, producing exotic and colourful hybrids. They began propagating chords. To start off with, this really only meant one or two possible notes, like this one. The note we've added is a B flat, and when you add it to the chord of C major, you create a whole new type of chord. The note we've added is called a seventh because it lies 7 steps up the musical scale from the bottom of the chord. What's so useful about adding a seventh to a chord is it gives that chord a new property, which turns it from a confident primary chord sort of a guy into something that's more vulnerable and needy. And that's because, musically speaking, it is more needy. You see, if you add a B flat to the chord of C, you destabilize that chord of C, and it now desperately wants to move to the strong chord of F major, like this. The ability to turn a chord from one mood to another, or to make it want to lean towards some other chord, was considered, rightly so, to be of immense musical value, because it was another device that you could use to make your harmony have more forward movement and energy. You should be able to hear what a difference these added notes make if I do a simple series of chords without any additions or modifications at all. Now I'm going to add a seventh to every other triad. Rock and roll practically lives on seventh chords. Listen how often this seventh chord, C sharp, crops up in the Phil Medley Burt Russell standard, Twist and Shout. These seventh chords were small fry compared to the kinds of exotic hybrids romantic composers and more recently jazz musicians liked. For Mozart, or early rock and rollers for that matter, ambiguity or uncertainty in your chords were bad things. You should be able to tell where the harmony's heading. For jazz giants like Miles Davis, though, the ambiguity offered by these hybrid chords was a good thing. It meant the harmony could head off in any direction it liked. Wagner would have approved. Creating unpredictability in your chords can be achieved by cultivating hybrids, piling one chord on top of another. But an even more drastic method is to tamper with the structure of the triads themselves. Think cosmetic surgery, think enlargement and reduction, or, in musical jargon, augmentation and diminution. So we could take a basic triad of E flat, which are these 3 notes, and to augment this triad, we need to add a slightly higher note to the top. Here it is. This slightly higher note now replaces the B flat, and our new augmented E flat sounds like this. So much for augmentation. If you want to diminish a chord, you've got to do the opposite. You've got to make it a bit smaller. So a C major triad normally sounds like this. But I'm going to reduce the size of this triad by taking away the bottom note. And our new chord starts here. The diminished chord sounds like this. Every time you diminish or augment a chord, you change its behavior. After all, if I had a part of my body enlarged, I'd probably start behaving differently. Diminished and augmented chords are volatile, ambiguous, and unpredictable. all qualities that suited the fast, freewheeling style of jazz musicians like John Coltrane. In their hands, chords stopped simply progressing one after another. Instead, they were overlapping and cascading into each other in a constant stream. All of the above techniques, major and minor triads, suspensions, passing notes, augmentations, diminutions, and other chord combinations were gradually absorbed into Western music over a period of roughly 300 years. And over the last century, they've begun to intermingle promiscuously, so that you might expect to hear a chord progression familiar to Bach suddenly crop up in a contemporary pop song.
Windmill, windmill for the land, forever hand in hand. Take it all out on your stride. It is taking, falling down. Love forever, love is free. Let's turn forever.
Since its emergence over 7 centuries ago, Western harmony hasn't stood still. It's fused with other musical systems. Bollywood is a case in point. It's a remarkable fact that, being the only musical culture to have developed harmony through chords, Western music has now also exported it to other cultures. Indian music, for example, which has its own impressive and colourful 2,000-year-old musical tradition, has adopted Western harmony with considerable flair and enthusiasm. Bollywood music these days is a combination of Indian melody and rhythm and Western harmony.
गुलशन में गुल खिलते हैं जब सहरा में मिलते हैं गुलशन में गुल खिलते हैं जब सहरा में मिलते हैं मैं और तू.
Harmony makes music sound warmer and fuller, but it has also undoubtedly enriched the emotional possibilities of music. Hearing voices sing together, brought closer by the added dimension of chords and their progressions, is one of the most beautiful things humankind has created in the last 500 years. Whether it's been to glorify God or express some deeply felt personal yearning, chordal harmony is one of our most spectacularly successful musical gifts.
'Cause you give me something that makes me scared, alright. This could be nothing, but I'm willing to give it a try. Please give me something, 'cause someday I might know. You've only waited up for hours just to spend a little time alone with me. And I could say I've never bought you flowers.